With me in the studio, with the Smiths in his AirPods, is the Times columnist James Marriott. Hello, James.
Good morning.
Have you heard of the Smiths?
I have, and I've actually heard quite a lot of the Smiths. They're a big thing when I was at university, but have oddly faded now, I think probably due to Morrissey's political views.
That's James there, who went to university about 10 years before he was born. And meanwhile, jamming out to Blur, it's the Sunday Times' Charlotte Ivers.
Hello, Hugo. Was Morrissey the one that ended up with his memoir became a Penguin classic the moment it came out and everyone got very angry?
Of course it
I
is.
remember being annoyed by that when I was about 16.
You know what? So this is a joke that would only land well with an older generation than perhaps you two. But when that book came out, I did my Saturday My Week column on Morrissey, because that's how long I've been writing it, and I made every day Sunday, and the subdesk downstairs thought it was a mistake and changed it back, and I had quite the argument. Anyway, let's crack on. We will get back into your taste in music slightly later on. Let's talk about political violence, because it feels like every couple of years the issue of political violence becomes a mainstream topic of debate in Westminster after some kind of shocking incident. And right now, of course, it's all about the death of Anne Widdecombe. Reform MPs are concerned about their own safety. That her death is now being treated as a politically motivated incident. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, announced yesterday that counter-terror police are now in charge of the investigation after detectives found material which suggested political ideology could be a factor in the case. Nigel Farage has agreed to meet with security experts following the Home Secretary's invitation to talk about more protection for Reform MPs. This is a story over which I feel I have a degree of sort of intimate understanding, because my father was an MP when I was a kid, and he was indeed he was in the cabinet, and we had quite a decent amount of security here and there. I grew up in a home of panic buttons and sort of torches with mirrors attached to them so we could check for bombs under the car and so on. And indeed, when in London, when he was in the cabinet, with sort of armed guards around the place. So I do get the concerns. Do you think, Charlotte, that just that the threat against MPs has changed meaningfully in the last decade or so, basically since the death of Joe Cox, and that more now needs to be done, even for people who aren't in the cabinet, even for people who aren't facing a direct organised terror threat?
I would say the threat has changed, and you can see the numbers going up of threats received, for example, reports made to the police, but you can also see the money spent on MP security going up. So I think that we have seen a pretty substantial effort by the parliamentary authorities to meet the scale of the challenge. I think as well, you've sort of got to weigh up, haven't you, the risks and also the kind of threat to all of us, the threat to democracy, if people are murdered or if people are attacked, God forbid. And there are examples so Boris Johnson, for example, when he was just a backbench Tory MP and it became very clear he was soon to become Prime Minister, suddenly he got state-sponsored security, and it was very kind of low-key. I remember I only found out because I could recognise one of the Prime Minister's security people holding a door open for him, and I thought, oh, okay, yep. The deep state has decided you're our next Prime Minister then. So you can't give it to everyone because there is just a limited amount of money. So I think there are two things you have to look at. You have to look at, has there been a direct threat against someone? And there are various backbench MPs where that is the case and they do have elevated security. Or you have to look at, even if no one's made a threat, would it be really, really bad for us if this person got assassinated as a country? And in the case of someone like Nigel Farage, I think, given that there is a plausible case he could be our next Prime Minister, although I'd put less money on that now than I would have done a couple of months ago, he really should have security. In terms of his backbench MPs, probably it's more the case of looking at has there been a direct threat.
James, I had a message on Twitter not that long ago from a guy he's an ex-policeman in Glasgow, and he wanted to tell me about the time, and I think it was in the late 1980s, which I remembered. We'd been driving through Glasgow as a family. My father would have been Scottish Secretary at the time, and someone crashed into the back of our car, and he was one of the police on the scene, and he helped us pull the bumper off the back of the car, and he drove away. And he said, I've been telling people this story for years, and no one believes me that the Scottish Secretary was driving around a dodgy bit of Glasgow late at night in the 1980s with zero security. But indeed he was, because that is how we lived. That is not how it would be today, one feels. What has changed in our society that MPs are under more risk than they used to be?
It's a really good question. I think one of the difficult things about the new nature of the political threat faced by MPs is that obviously, we know in the 1970s and 80s the IRA posed a huge threat to cabinet ministers. They succeeded in bombing the hotel in Brighton. I think what's difficult now is that we know that an organisation like the IRA was looking for high-profile government ministers to take out for propaganda purposes. The new kind of terrorism we're seeing that seems to be bred online is much more individualised, and you're getting these lone characters who develop a weird fixation on a particular MP or former MP, and therefore I think it is much less obvious who is a target. When you think of the MPs who've sadly been murdered over the last few years, David Amess, Joe Cox, these wouldn't be if you were in the IRA, the top people on your government hit list, who you're going to take out, your cabinet ministers, your Margaret Thatcher, your party conference gathered in a hotel in Brighton. Anne Widdecombe, not a political figure I devoted much thought to in
at least a decade.
Yeah, at least a decade. But somebody's thinking about her, and I think that's what's difficult. Is it's much more individualized. People can develop much more strange obsessions online, and I think it's just going to become increasingly difficult to say who deserves security and who doesn't, because it's very hard to predict the nature of these threats nowadays.
I think that's right. Look, there are so many angles to this story, and I want to try and sort of cover a few of them. Nigel Farage, he was criticised for using Widdecombe's murder as political propaganda over the last couple of days, and for talking about how basically saying this has to be a politically linked murder, even while the police were saying there was no evidence of that. Has he been vindicated by new developments, the fact that it's now being looked at by counter-terrorism police, or is it impossible for him to be vindicated? Because even if he thought it were true, is it still something he shouldn't have said, Charlotte?
We're back on the old philosophy degree thing here, aren't we? Do I know something if I don't actually have any evidence for it and I happen to coincidentally...
knowledge being a true justified belief. You
exactly.
need all three.
Gosh,
yeah.
it's so fun being on air with you, Hugo. I don't think Nigel Farage was justified. I think anybody getting out ahead of their skis when there is a live investigation is always playing with fire. I do not think the police are infallible. Clearly, in this case, they got completely the wrong guy at the start and then had to hard pivot, 24 hours or so into their investigation. But if the police don't know 100% of what is going on, then what do you and I know? What does Nigel Farage know? Very, very little. And to make any sort of speculations at early stages of an investigation is completely absurd. You are going off little to no evidence, and just because you occasionally happen to be correct, and again, we don't even know necessarily if this is correct. There clearly some sort of political material has been found in the home of this suspect. Do we know that this guy absolutely did it? No, we don't, because there hasn't been a trial yet. Do we know that material was linked to what happened? Do we even know exactly what happened? No, we don't. So I think the idea that Nigel Farage was, in some way had this establishment stitch up stopping him from speaking the truth is for the birds, really.
Well, so, I mean, look, there has been some suggestion that Farage in the past was offered some degree of sort of state-provided security and felt it wasn't adequate and turned it down. And we also know that he had his millions of pounds given to him by a friend to pay for his security. Richard Tice, speaking to the Times, said it's as though some in the establishment want us dead, talking about the failure thus far of parliamentary authorities, of the police, to routinely provide security or the right level, they say, of security for Reform MPs. And it's impossible not to recognise, James, how much the manner in which they are discussing this case plays into the anti-establishment politics that Reform is trying to establish, particularly in the by-election in Clacton. At the same time, I'm really reluctant to call Tice when he says that, even though I think it's as though some in the establishment want us dead. I feel that's a fairly incendiary statement. I'm reluctant to call him insincere, because I think he's probably a frightened and alarmed man. I mean, just know where you come down on this, whether you think they are exploiting this politically, or whether you think they're exploiting it politically but kind of sort of don't mean to be, because they're still sort of being sincere. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's a very silly thing to say, and I think that is...
Do you mean him, not me?
I think Richard Tice, not Hugo Rifkind.
Thanks.
In this instance.
Just make that clear. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a silly thing to say. I think it's clearly overblown. I think he must know it's not true, and I think it just feeds, unfortunately, this vicious cycle of an increasingly hysterical politics, in which people throw around increasingly mad ideas about how much everybody hates each other, and I think, unfortunately, that is ultimately the atmosphere that's driving the increase in political violence that we're seeing. I think that's a very silly thing to say.
What do you think about that, Charlotte?
I would agree with James, and the question of does he believe it is a really interesting one, because I think he probably does. I think there is such a siege mentality in Reform UK, and I remember, this must have been a couple of years ago, I'd approached Richard Tice for comment about something, nothing aggressive. I think I was just profiling someone or something, and I got a bit of a tirade back saying, your newspaper has done XYZ to me, and I was like, I don't think it has, because my newspaper hasn't been out for 4 days, because I work for the Sunday Times, and you're saying something happened yesterday. And it turned out he was annoyed with the Times, and there is this real sense that everyone is out to get them, and they're sort of, they think that, I was speaking to some people at the Telegraph who are saying Reform think they're sort of not quite a lefty rag, but they are trying to get the Conservatives into government and, are crushing Reform. And you sort of think, gosh, who are your friends then? They really do have this intense sense that everyone is out to get them. And actually, I think that is wrong. I think there's been a lot of actually quite generous coverage of Reform UK. I think a lot of people have taken Nigel Farage very seriously. I think a lot of people have covered their press conferences. There have been some quite fawning profiles, frankly, that haven't scrutinised them very much. But what happens is, as you get closer to government, people start looking at you more and more seriously and dissecting you. And I think if any leader of a political party had taken £5 million from someone a bit dodgy, we would be writing about it, we'd be asking questions about it. And I don't think they're getting special treatment in any direction.
Well, lots more to come. We're going to be talking about Andy Burnham's first speech in Parliament, which is coming up. We're going to be talking about Kemi Badenoch's purging of the wets in the Conservative Party, and we're going to be talking about political whimsy as well. That's all to come. On Times Radio, currently unpacking the politics of the day with Charlotte Ivers and James Marriott. We were, of course, discussing the murder of Anne Widdecombe. Times Radio has been given a recording of a final interview to the Christian speech radio station TWR UK. We've been granted permission by Anne's family to play an excerpt because, as you'll hear, it demonstrates Anne's robust and lively political views.
There has been a game now for a very long time, a game of personal destruction, not just for Nigel, for lots and lots of politicians have faced this. What Clinton once described as the politics of personal destruction. And I think that another thing is, and Nigel is going to say, well, don't always expect people just to writhe in your coils. They may actually turn on you, and I'm now setting the example of that and leading the way.
Well, James Maidman Fullard, the broadcaster who interviewed her, also spoke to the station.
She was not only a committed public servant, but political life was never really the thing that defined her. Her faith defined her. I'm absolutely convinced that she was ever in a position where she'd had to choose between her politics and her relationship with Jesus, she would have chosen Jesus every single time, because Jesus was the anchor of her life and it shaped the way that she saw the world.
Charlotte, the politics of personal destruction are a hell of a thing for a politician who was later killed to talk about in her last interview. What do you think about that phrase? What do you think she's talking about? She's got a point, doesn't she?
I suppose so. What she's talking about is the fact that a lot of the stories about Reform UK are about Nigel Farage personally and choices Nigel Farage has made and things Nigel Farage has done that are now being investigated by... Oh, actually, no, sorry, they were being investigated by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, but because he has stopped being an MP, that has now paused. Is this a problem? Well, first, let's say that I can see why it's happening, because Reform UK fundamentally is a bit of a personality cult. It is based around one man, more so than any other political party for a long time, I think. So there is always going to be a lot of focus on the character of that one man and on what he believes, because what he says goes in that party, at least for the moment. Is it a problem? I just think it's stories about financial propriety. I don't think that's a massive invasion of privacy. I'm trying to think what sort of story would make me uncomfortable. I think a story about Nigel Farage's children, for example, if, I don't know, one of them had been up to no good, had got some sort of caution for, you were the child of a politician. I don't want to...
Can I say I did not publicly get up to no good?
Well,
But I knew kids who did, in fact, and it was ruinous, those kinds of stories.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
There was a story, wasn't there, about Ewan Blair, who'd been out on a big one, and he'd, I think, been woken up by police sleeping on a park bench. I don't think I'd be happy seeing politicians' children today being held to account by that. So I can imagine the sort of personal... attack is the wrong word. Personal story that would be a problem, but I don't think anything that's been thrown at Nigel Farage thus far is that.
James Widdecombe there also, very clear from that interview how much she would... faith came before politics. Politics came out of faith. That's quite unfashionable these days.
Yeah, very unfashionable. Although I suppose, in a way, so strangely unfashionable that it's come back into fashion. there is this strain on the right that is quite obviously picked up from America that wants to revive a kind of Christian conservatism, a Christian idea, a sort of Christian idea of conservative politics. I think very clearly influenced by America. I think Anne Widdecombe was in that instance oddly aligned with Reform simply because she was such an old-fashioned character. I'm really not convinced there's much future for that kind of politics in Britain, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sure we'll end up talking about that a lot more. Look, let's turn to Andy Burnham, our Prime Minister in waiting, because he's speaking in Parliament today for the first time since returning to the Commons. He'll be paying tribute to the new Hillsborough Law as a model of redistributing power. It's also going to be an ideal moment for him to set out his vision of the country going forwards, if indeed he chooses to wish to do so. Look, it's his first speech in the Commons since he was sworn in last month. James, do you think all the doubters, all the people who say there's not much there beyond a black or allegedly dark blue T-shirt, all those doubters, they're going to be shut up by just how great a performance he's about to give?
That seems very unlikely. I would say that the idea that there's not much underneath the blue and black T-shirt, I sometimes wonder, having witnessed a succession of prime ministers, how much more they need to ask for in this day and age. I think probably a cosmetic improvement on the previous Labour Prime Minister might be something that people will feel in the Labour Party relatively happy with. I can't feel particularly optimistic myself, but I guess we'll see.
He's always been vocal, Charlotte, about Hillsborough, about the Hillsborough disaster. He was one of perhaps Parliament's foremost campaigner for justice for the families of Hillsborough, and yet he seems now, and what we would expect in his speech as well, he's going to link that to his sort of broader sense of devolution, broader sense that basically what happened in Hillsborough is what happens when the concerns of an entire city, in this case Liverpool, can be ignored because they're not the prevailing political narrative. He obviously has a point as relates to Hillsborough, but can you broaden that out into a sort of a wider political narrative? Can you see justice for Hillsborough as being fundamentally a point about devolution, a point about what a better nation ought to look like?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because
it's fascinating.
I think the idea of the state turning on you and deciding you're an enemy is absolutely terrifying, because if anyone else turns on you and decides that they're your enemy, you've got the state to protect you and you have no recourse. Does that get fixed if you have, I don't know, your local council, for example, or the local mayor turn on you or deny you information or access to justice? I suppose what you do have is multiple layers of recourse. So, you know, if your local council's a problem, you go to the mayor, or if the mayor's a problem, you go to the national government. I'm slightly of the belief, though, that even at the most devolved level, institutions are really good at protecting themselves, and institutions, particularly public institutions, create their own bureaucracies that sort of coalesce and stultify around themselves. And does just because something's happening in, I don't know, Burnley instead of London, I don't think that it's necessarily that different. I'm sort of broadly pro this law, although I'm a bit worried about how it applies to the security services. Interestingly, I actually interviewed Andy Burnham a couple of years ago about this, along with Steve Rotherham, who's the mayor of Liverpool, and they
wrote a book together, didn't they?
Yeah, they wrote a book together, and it opens with Hillsborough. And on the day, what had happened is, I think Andy Burnham it was a semi-final, wasn't it? Andy Burnham was at the other semi-final, and he had this thing where he was desperately trying to get through to his mate, who he knew had been at Hillsborough, and he phoned his mate's mum's house, and her mum picked up and was like, is that you? And he just put the phone down because he was so horrified by what he'd done and giving this woman hope. Steve Rotherham was at Hillsborough, and he had a ticket for the stand where the crush happened, and as he was walking in, I think someone, I can't remember how it came about, but he swapped his ticket with someone because they fancied being with their mates in that stand, and he never knew what had happened to that person. And he could have died had he been there. He didn't know if that person had lived, and he's got this immense survivor's guilt about it. And he had talked, I don't know whether he's had any update on this, but he talked to me about how he'd had a Facebook message from someone who said they thought they might be that person about 6 months ago.
Remarkable.
And it's just such a remarkable thing. And it really struck me that there are these, we often talk about prime ministers often have a kind of childhood tragedy, they've lost a parent or something like that, but this is a much different event than that, and neither of them were in the crush themselves, but these things really stick with people, and I think they can sort of shape people forever. So it's quite fitting in a way, I suppose, whatever you think of the Hillsborough Law, that this becomes one of Andy Burnham's first big things.
James, it makes me think that either he does have this sort of like huge different vision for Britain, the likes of which we're just going to have to sort of catch up with, or he doesn't. You know what I mean?
My sense is very strongly that he probably doesn't. I don't think there's anything particularly to lead us to believe that huge substantive change is coming. I think the change in tone is probably smart. I think the default position of the British electorate at the moment is like very anti-establishment, in lots of places very anti-London. And I think this whole idea of governing in a kind of or attempting, insofar as possible, to govern with a bit of an anti-establishment vibe and to get outside London and to continually pose as an outsider is probably the only sustainable way to I don't know whether it'll work in this instance, but I think realistically, from that cosmetic point of view, it's like the most sustainable way to do politics nowadays.
Elsewhere, the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, has removed the whip from Lord Barwell. That's Gavin Barwell. He was the Chief of Staff under Theresa May, former Cabinet Minister as well, I believe. It comes amid reports that she launched a purging of the Tory Wets campaign. Gavin Barwell spoke to Times Radio Breakfast this morning.
And I think you would struggle to think of any other party leader in recent history who has kicked somebody out just for disagreeing with them about strategy. I mean, when I do criticise her, it's not because I'm trying to undermine her or I want somebody else to be the leader of the party. I want her to win. I want her to do well. And I don't think her strategy is quite right at the moment. It's not working. And I'm trying to constructively suggest a different way of doing things. To kick someone out of the whip for that I just think is bizarre.
James, I don't know how much you know about Barwell, but he's been an occasional visitor on How to Win an Election, so I've spoken to him quite a few times. He makes for an unlikely sort of radical rebel, I would say. Is this strength from Kemi Badenoch trying to slap a party into line, or is it a sort of weakness, a sort of a thin-skinnedness?
To me, it reads as weakness and thin-skinnedness. I think if you are going to be a party political leader, the greater show of strength is the ability to show that you can handle a diverse party and lead a diverse coalition forwards. It reminds me a little bit of Keir Starmer's purging of the Labour left, which at the time I think we took as a symbol of Keir Starmer's so tough, he's so intransigent, he might be uncharismatic, but he's getting his head down and he's just kicking out the people he doesn't like and he's prepared to have fights. I think in hindsight that's actually more a symptom of weakness and probably was linked to his inability to lead, and I think a more charismatic leader with greater political skills would have made that broad coalition work. And I slightly worry if the same thing is true of Kemi Badenoch, who to me has a kind of narrowness and a kind of intransigence that sometimes, to me, I know it's a weird comparison, doesn't seem a million miles away from Keir Starmer. I also just think it's politically silly. I think the direction she's trying to lead the Conservative Party in, to be a sort of competitor to reform, has probably limited mileage in it. And I think I know I sound like I would say this, but I think the Gavin Barwell direction and that more Lib Demi, fiscally responsible appeal the Conservative Party might have, it seems silly to try and distance yourself from that part of your political tradition, which I think is probably quite electorally hopeful at the moment.
But it's also seemed to be the direction that Kemi Badenoch, until frankly this morning, was kind of heading in. Charlotte, you're Kemi Badenoch. You take... You only kick out Robert Jenrick by the time when he's already sort of dangling by a thread and about to jump. Yet you kick out Gavin Barwell, on the basis of almost nothing at all. Does she know who her friends are?
Yeah, it's interesting because Gavin Barwell was not like Robert Jenrick causing these kind of mass problems. I don't think he had a kind of great following of people who were being inspired by him to think that Kemi Badenoch is a bit rubbish. So we've got to ask why pluck him out of obscurity to do this. And it must be because Badenoch and her team, this is assuming that they've thought this through, which isn't necessarily a given, but let's assume they have. They are trying to tell us something. So what are they trying to tell us here? That either that she's kind of big and strong and doesn't tolerate dissent, and as James says, that could in fact show a bit of weakness. Really powerful leaders don't really care if some kind of gnat is biting at their feet. But she could also be trying to tell us something about her politics, and I think it's probably the latter, particularly when you look at the fact that the Conservatives have been vetting their candidates for the next election, and they've been basically not letting anybody who doesn't want to leave the ECHR and a couple of other fairly hardline policies onto the list. So I think it's that. I think it's saying here is wishy-washy Gavin Barwell, who's basically a Lib Dem, and we'll have none of that from big strong Kemi. You could trust me to be a bit like reform. James then also highlights correctly the question of whether that's the right electoral strategy, and I don't know. I think the Conservatives sort of need a coalition of both a few Lib Dems in Surrey to vote for them and also a few kind of red wally people to vote for them as well. I think if I were leader of the Conservative Party, I'd be trying to pull the conversation round to fiscal responsibility, because then you can get both of those sets of people like that. We probably will be talking less and less about immigration if Nigel Farage has been weakened, and also because numbers are coming down. So there is going to be a void, in theory, for what the next big national conversation will be. Andy Burnham, I think, will spend. I think he loves to spend money. So if I were Badenoch, I'd sort of be circling all of my tanks to point in that direction to be ready when the time comes.
James, Badenoch, she's also been taking in applications for prospective MPs looking to stand in the next general election, and she says she wants them to have 5 C's, and those 5 C's are clever, charisma, communication, conviction and conservative. Can we, James, trust someone who clearly thinks they're listing 5 nouns when one of them is an adjective?
Hang on, which is the adjective?
Clever. Do you have clever? Can clever be a noun?
Oh, God. But did she specifically say she was looking for 5 nouns, or did she just say she was looking for 5 qualities?
It's a bit weird that the rest of them are nouns.
Hang on. Clever, conservative.
Clever, charisma. Surely, if you're going to be clever, you should be charismatic.
Yeah,
you shouldn't be charisma.
That is awkward.
You know, I thought you were going to be my brother on this. If even James Marriott's not going to support me on grammar, I'm lost. Let's move on, James. Now it's time for this.
And I think that one of the people who has diagnosed the problem best is the Times writer James Marriott.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael Gove. James, in your column today, you talk about the sudden attention that's fallen upon Count Binface. Some people are finding his satire funny, others aren't so sure. You're not so sure. You hate him and his whimsy.
I have to say I do a bit. Although I should say I think there's a basic thing which I find funny, which is the idea of Nigel Farage being humiliated running against a joke comedy candidate. I think that in itself, that basic premise is amusing. What I find less amusing is the national enforcement of Count Binface as this mandatory thing we all have to find incredibly funny, when unfortunately the more I hear from him, the less I have to say that I find him particularly witty or original. I just find all the jokes a bit lame. A 99 ice cream should cost 99p. We should nationalise Adele. I think he should get up on the platform in his silly costume. I think that's funny. I find him as a comic character less funny. I find the fact I have to listen to him on every single TV show out there quite tedious, and I have a real allergy to organised fun. I hate when everyone gets together and decides that this is the funny thing that we're all going to find very jolly. And at the moment I feel, as I say in the column, a bit like I'm living in a nation-sized holiday camp where we've all gathered together for the comedy act, and it's doing my head in a little bit. I mean, I know I'm out on a limb in this one. I keep thinking I feel a little bit like what it must have been like, as I was saying to you, in 1997, to be the only person not grieving Princess Diana. I just don't get it. I don't find it funny, and I wish it was over. And the other point in my column is that, unfortunately, I think this also connects to a great flaw in our national character, which is the British weakness for often quite unfunny whimsy, tweeness, archness that I think has a very long history, and we're never really going to get rid of it, sadly.
I absolutely loved this column, as I told you before on air, and I loved it not because I agreed with it, because I basically didn't, but just because I think it showed us the true James Marriott, the man James is going to be when he's much older and his career starts to go to the dogs, and just how bitter and cross he's going to be. And I, for one, am here for it. What do you think, Charlotte?
I agree entirely with James. It's a one-line joke. There is a man with a bin on his head. That is really funny. I'm not going to blame Count Binface for this, because he is saying yes to people inviting him on Newsnight or whatever. He's been on Times Radio to ask him stupid questions, and he will give stupid answers. And who amongst us doesn't love attention? Wouldn't be here otherwise. But it's a one-line joke. Got a bin on his head. I mean, to be fair to him, it's a joke he started 10 years ago. Yeah. He's literally designed to be a character that stands weirdly in the background. He's not supposed to be the next like Zelensky or whatever. That's not kind of the idea. Where I do think you're on strong ground though is the war on twee. I think I will join you in the war on twee. Although again, you had a go at the Queen jumping out of a plane in the 2012 Olympics. What kind of centrist are you?
I know. I have to say, I did find that very silly. All this stuff just drives me nuts, and I think it's easy to become inured to it, and we've got used to the idea that as a country we're just not going to take ourselves remotely seriously. We're going to have a cat called Larry the Cat that has a withering Twitter account.
I won't hear a word against Larry. Larry's listening,
I'm sorry, I'm not a fan. We're going to the Queen's last Jubilee was celebrated with people dressed up as cream cakes dancing in the Mall. it just goes on, and everybody is guilty. Nigel Farage, there's one of the most viewed clips in his Twitter account is a video of him standing next to a pile of melons in a supermarket saying "lovely melons" and wiggling his eyebrows suggestively, and one-off. The odd political sideshow, yeah, maybe I'd find it okay, but the sort of relentless institutionalization of whimsy I'm finding really kind of sickening at this point, and it just, the more mainstream it becomes and the more it becomes the accepted and almost mandatory way of doing politics, the less funny I find it. Sorry to be a grouch.
What you're basically objecting to is humour when it goes mainstream and leaves the intelligentsia behind and becomes accessible to everybody. You're basically a man who hates Mrs. Brown's Boys.
I think I'm actually objecting to the humour as adopted by the establishment. I think satirists should be on the sideline and people mocking politics should be on the sideline, laughing at it from the outside and making politicians seem ridiculous. It all makes me very queasy when suddenly politicians and people in positions of power decide they're going to somehow, I think part of the idea is to neuter the satire by doing it yourself. If you're mocking yourself, the joke's already done. You can't be mocked. You can't be serious because you've already attempted to diffuse it. I do actually think there's something a little bit, I'm going to say, sinister there, without wishing to get too completely hysterical about Count Binface.
Yeah, that is the humourless aping of comedy by people who don't necessarily understand what it is, which I do not think is where lovely Binface, what a fine man, is coming from. Let's talk about music. Well, I've got you guys. More in Common has done a poll on people's voting intention by taste in pop music. Reform are strongest among Dua Lipa and Take That fans. Is that surprising? Perhaps a little bit. The Tories do best among One Direction fans. I'm just completely baffled by that. The Greens dominate among Chapel Roan fans. I'm too old to know what that means, although my kids could probably tell me. And if only Kendrick Lamar fans could vote, it would be a Labour landslide. What do you take from all this, Charlotte?
What do I take from all of this? I don't have much to say about the specifics of music. What I will say, though, is that I did bump into Hugo and his family at a music festival.
Who, me?
Yeah, do you remember this?
No.
I think we were watching Haim or something. It was All Points East.
Oh, yes,
You were with your kids,
absolutely.
so you can't have been too hammered to remember it. And I remember thinking, gosh, that's so cool, and I hope I'm cool like Hugo when I grow up.
One day you will be, man.
Yeah, this was about 4 or 5 years ago, and I probably am just old and boring like you now. But anyway, so I think my main takeaway from this is not, it's really interesting that One Direction fans like the Conservatives. I think it's interesting to me because there is this really depressing fact, which is that if you give me your postcode, just your postcode, but actually, if you add in something like income or education level, I can basically tell you, well, not me personally, but Luke Trill, who did this poll, he can basically tell you where you're going to shop, what your values are going to be, how you vote, how you feel about major issues, and probably as well now what your favourite band is. We are so predictable.
Yeah.
It's all kind of, we all think we're coming up with our interesting opinions, but actually it's all socioeconomic, which maybe that's fine. Maybe it's nice to be part of a tribe. I don't know.
This is something I first realised in about 2005-ish when my wife and I, my girlfriend then, were shopping for our first flat. And with all the flats we go and see, we came to the kind of shocking realisation that in every flat, all the books on the bookshelves were the same as the books on our bookshelves, to the point where it became a game to see who could first spot a copy of Jonathan Franzen's The Connections, because it would be on every single bookshelf. James, you've been writing about this, music for voters. What do you think?
All I can say is what you've said, which is that I agree that our lives are socioeconomically determined. We're members of our generation. We're not in control of our taste. We're formed by environments. But then I look at this and I just think, I don't understand that at all. That blows that whole theory apart. As you say, why is Dua Lipa so popular among Reform fans? There are some things that I find roughly explicable. Paul McCartney is obviously most popular among Conservatives because we know that the very oldest people in the electorate vote Conservative. Paul McCartney is probably enjoyed by the very oldest people. Ed Sheeran's popularity among Reform, is that just because he's so incredibly popular that it begins to align with national voting intention?
As the kids would say, it's because they're basic.
But no, I find Chapel Roan being popular among Green supporters, I kind of get that, but there's so much that bewilders me that I kind of find it fascinating and incomprehensible, and I can't stop staring at it.
It sounds like your approach to the world. James Marriott, Charlotte Ivers, thank you very much indeed. I've been Hugo Rifkind.